There we go. Okay, so as you can see, we've had a very busy 12 months at Jane Austen Co. And I want to take a minute to thank Nadea Pugh, our technical director, for first off editing these videos, and second off just being the brilliant behind the scenes person who really keeps us afloat. So thank you, Nadea, for everything. Really, since 2019, with original founders Inger Brodey and Anne Fertig, Jane Austen Co. has been aiming to provide top-notch programming related to Jane Austen. And it started as in-person events at local libraries. And part of what we're doing tonight is kind of recollecting that and taking advantage of being together in person. But in general, and for the foreseeable future, we are aiming to offer public virtual lectures that are focused on Jane Austen, as well as the life, histories, and material cultures of other female novelists in the 18th and 19th centuries. Because we want to encourage North Carolinians and people from across the world to engage with Austen's novels in ways that uplift the human spirits and address big perennial questions. So we are back in person tonight, and we will be recording this and posting this to our website in a little bit. And this particular program, and most of our Austen and Brontes series as well, is made possible by the North Carolina Humanities. We want to give them a special shout out. The North Carolina Humanities are a statewide nonprofit and the state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. And they are in the business of connecting North Carolinians with cultural experiences that spur dialogue, deepen human connections, and inspire community. My name is Eric Bontempo. I'm one of the directors of Jane Austen and Company, along with Inga and Nadea. And when I found out that not just one, but two members of our Jane Austen and Company team have published new books this summer, and I believe Inga's book came out 7 weeks ago. Susan, your book came out 3 weeks ago. I really wanted to organize a kind of a special celebration for the two of them to commemorate their very, very big achievements. Both Inga and Susan have been wonderful mentors to me, and I'm very thankful for their collegiality and their friendship, and I'm just excited to dive into a great discussion with them in just a little bit. Let me go ahead and introduce Inga and Susan, who I think many of you may know already. And there is my special thanks to the North Carolina Humanities. So, Inger Brodey is a professor of English at UNC. She also holds affiliate positions at the School of Civic Life and Leadership and in the Department of Asian Studies. Her primary interest is in the history of the novel in late 18th and early 19th century Europe and Meiji Japan. You may also know her as the founding director of the Jane Austen Summer Program and Jane Austen and Company. And now she is the author of a new book on Jane Austen and the Price of Happiness, published with Johns Hopkins University Press. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about this book because that's why we're all here. But the main question it explores is, do Jane Austen novels truly celebrate or undermine romance and happy endings? So for those interested, we do have a discount code for this book available. And we have flyers as well. If you want to pick one up at some point this evening, you can get a 30% discount. And I'll share the discount code as well again at the end of this evening. But now let me introduce Susan Allen Ford. Susan Allen Ford is retired professor of English from Delta State University in Mississippi, and she has served as editor for Persuasions, the leading Austen journal, since 2006. She has been a huge part of the Jane Austen Summer Program since its inception and is also a member of its board of directors. Her new book, What Jane Austen's Characters Read and Why, offers the first detailed accounts of Austen's characters' reading experiences. And this evening, in the first part of this, moderated discussion, Inga and Susan will be sharing more about their books, and I also have a couple questions for them as well. And then I'm going to turn it over to you all for some audience Q&A. So there's going to be ample time after you hear from them for you to ask them questions and to even get to talk to them after our event concludes. Okay, so we're now going to start our discussion part of tonight's events. And I'm going to be turning things over to Susan first, and then Inga, to each talk a little bit about your books. And so Susan, why don't we start with you? Could you give the big ideas, major arguments of your book, and also talk a little bit about why you undertook such a project? What compelled you to write this very well-informed and carefully researched book on what Jane Austen characters read and why?
So Eric asked me to think a little bit about why I wrote a book about books in Jane Austen's books. And really I've always kind of been interested in metafiction, in things that make us realize the fictionality of the book we're reading while we're reading it. And I've especially been interested in books in books. Could you go to the next slide? So when I was very young, my younger brother, who was, well, I was probably about 3 or so, and he had a Tommy Tippy cup. And I was always fascinated by Tommy Tippy because here was my brother drinking out of this mug with a bear on it, Tommy Tippy, drinking out of a mug with Tommy Tippy on it, and you can see that Tommy Tippy is also drinking out of a mug that presumably has Tommy Tippy on it. And even at that age, I thought, wow, that just goes on infinitely. So I think that's part of what got me just sort of interested in this whole idea of this a beam that we're going into. But also when I was 12, my mother for Christmas gave me Irene Hunt's young adult novel, Up a Road Slowly, which had just won the Newbery Award. It's a coming-of-age novel, and the characters in it talked about Jane Austen and a little bit about Pride and Prejudice. Not a lot, but I really loved these characters, and I was interested in what they were interested in. So I took myself off to the public library, and I looked in the library for Jane Austen and Pride and Prejudice, and I started reading Austen then, and kind of the rest is history. And so all that, I think, was part of my background to this. And then in the 90s, I've been working on this book for a little bit. I was thinking about a session on Emma for Jasna's annual meeting, and I started wondering about Emma's reading lists and thinking about what might have been on them, because Mr. Knightley is very complimentary of the lists, but not of Emma's application. So I made my own list of everything that the characters seemed to have read in the book, and among other things, I read Madame de Genlis's Adelaide and Theodore, and that book was a real revelation to me. I started discovering things in that book that Austen clearly had used, like the precious treasures, the ages of the hero and the heroine, and the person that she doesn't marry in that book were all kind of corresponding to things. There were other elements of the book too, and that Austen is clearly paying attention to, and it's a novel about education and restraining the imagination. I mean, all these elements. And I just thought, wow, if she's doing so much, and with that book in Emma, and I don't know about that, what's she doing with the other things? And that just kind of took me on a fairly long and slow journey. So then I started thinking about what Austen's doing, how she's doing this thing, and why she's doing it, and what its effect might be on us. There are times that Austen mentioned a character in the novel just picking up a book, like Elizabeth at the beginning of the Netherfield scene. She picks up a book and says, "This is fine, I can read this," and we don't know what that book is. But there are other times, of course, when Austen is naming these books particularly. So clearly she means us to be thinking about that. And why? What does she have in mind? I'm also just interested in the way that if we're reading a novel in which a character is also reading a book too, and especially if it's a book that we've read or should have read, that character at some level becomes more real to us, I think, because we're sharing that reading experience. If I've read Udolpho and Catherine Morland has read Udolpho, now I've got a stronger bond somehow with Catherine Morland, and I think Austen is kind of helping us and asking us to create these bonds. It's also true that, and this is sort of the opposite, if I'm thinking, okay, here's a book with a novel in it, I'm somehow reminded that I'm reading a novel. So it's a kind of weird effect that sometimes I think it has. But one of the things that also was striking me during all this is that Austen is really kind of invested in the reality of her characters, and even her earliest readers are thinking about that. And Austen herself, Austen's nephew, James Edward Austen Lee, when he writes about her, talks about how she thought of characters in novels she read, like the characters in Sir Charles Grandison, as if they had been living friends. So she had that sense. And there's also, and you can go to the next slide here, I think, the way she thought about her own characters. You've probably seen this portrait before of Mrs. Q, Harriet Quinton. Austen went off to one of the exhibitions in London while she was there in 1813 and saw this portrait, and then she wrote to her sister, "I was very well pleased, particularly, pray tell Fanny, with a small portrait of Mrs. Bingley, excessively like her. I went in hopes of seeing one of her sister, but there was no Mrs. Darcy. Perhaps, however, I may find her at the great exhibition. I've no chance of her in the collection of Sir Joshua Reynolds' paintings, which is now showing in Pall Mall. Mrs. Bingley's is exactly like herself, or exactly herself, size, shaped face, features, and sweetness. There never was a greater likeness. She's dressed in a white gown with green ornaments, which convinces me of what I had always supposed, that green was a favorite color with her. I dare say Mrs. Darcy will be in yellow." And then, of course, she doesn't find Mrs. Darcy. We also see Jane Austen as a teenager, and you can go to the next slide here, writing herself into fiction. This is the parish registry at Steventon, where they record all the marriages. And the teenage Jane Austen has gone to the sample page at the beginning and entered in a marriage between Henry Frederick Howard Fitzwilliam of London and one Jane Austen, spinster of Steventon. And there are plenty of other examples. So I started thinking about this whole issue of characters and the living nature of characters and the books and the reality of characters. I also started thinking about this in terms of how Jane Austen was creating her readers, how she was creating us. And she's got a long history of being attentive to reader response. She builds them into her teenage writings. Later on, as you know, she collects opinions from people of Mansfield Park and Emma and lists them carefully out. And she's also relaying in her letters quite a lot what she's heard about her books from other people and sending that information on to Cassandra. So clearly she's paying attention to it and thinking about it as she's kind of thinking about what she's doing fictionally. I wanted to then spend some time as I got into this project, not just thinking about her novels, but thinking about the act and the circumstances of reading. What books did she own? Where did they come from? What do we know about the circulating libraries and the book societies to which she belonged? And one thing I learned was that over the course of the 18th century, more people in the aristocracy and in the gentry and in even the clergy circles were accumulating books and even designating rooms in their homes as a library to put them in. And though often, especially, that was a study that was reserved for the man of the house. Jane Austen's father, the Reverend George Austen, had a library of about 500 volumes. And you can still see his writing desk with a couple of bookshelves on the top of it at Jane Austen's house in Chawton today. David Gilson has identified in his bibliography about 20 titles with her name inscribed in them, and some of those books are from her childhood, some were given to her, some she bought. She subscribed to Frances Burney's Camilla. So, I mean, we get a sense that she's really involved in getting access to book through her lives. Okay, Eric, the next slide. But of course, circulating libraries were a big source. There are lots of references to these in her letters, and even when she's traveling, she seems to have joined them. We think about them, these circulating libraries, in terms of novels because people are always ranting about that. But there's a lot more there, and I don't know if you can see it, but in this version you see there's novels and romances and tales labeled on the shelves, but also sermons and voyages and travels and plays over on the end. And also every library has to have a dog. And then in the next scene, or the slide, yeah. This is a Lackington's library in London. You just get a sense of the wideness of the stock there. Is there a dog there? Do you see? No, there's not a dog in this one, but the next one will make up for it by having 2 or 3 dogs. So
average of a dog.
Yeah. But look to it at these guys at the front. I mean, they've got some kind of fold-out print that they're looking at along the floor. So it's a place that has a real variety of kinds of reading experience. Of course, another source was book societies, and she belonged to one of those too. And they categorized their books under headings like politics, history, natural history, biography, travels, theology, poetry, plays, criticism, letters, essays, trials. She's just got a very wide range of reading, I think more than we expect. Really, you get a sense as she's visiting her brother's home, but also as she's living at her own, that companionable reading in group is really kind of an important part of Jane Austen's experience. And Eric, do you want to go to this next slide? This is from Humphrey Repton's fragments of the theory and practice of landscape gardening. But he's making a contrast between the 18th century cedar parlor, like you see in Sir Charles Grandison, and the 19th century living room, which is more of a room that is designed for books. He says, "No more the cedar parlor's formal gloom with dullness chills. 'Tis now the living room." I want to go to the next one. Where guests to whim or taste or fancy true, scattered in groups their different plans pursue. And his poem continues to list different modes of reading, different subjects, different activities that are all contained in this same space. And you can see these different people reading different things. There's that one guy by the Fire, who's clearly a holdover from the 18th century, reading by himself. But, you know, these other people are really being sociable. So with these ideas of communities of readers, you can go to that next one, I guess. Oh, here's another dog, yes. This is this is another circulating library image. And here again, I guess, is what I wanted to say about this. Even more than the books, I mean, there are some, but there's a lot of other stuff going on here, and that's, I think, kind of interesting. So books are one part of social life, but and an important part, but they sort of coexist with all these other things. Okay, finally, go to that last slide. With all these ideas of community of readers, the range of genres that she's reading, the connections between readers and books and readers holding these books, I myself bustled off to the library and read my way through the novels and poems and travels and sermons and plays and essays and other things that Jane Austen's characters are reading to see what I could discover, and that's kind of what the book is about. So that's it.
Susan, it's very inspiring. It's a really wonderful piece of scholarship that Susan has given us. So, funny fonts have arisen. Okay. So my book is very different from Susan's, but there is some overlap. I think we're both very interested in metafiction, for one thing, or the way in which Austen makes us realize we're reading fiction. But mine started with, maybe go to the next slide, with some, with kind of an acknowledgement or a consciousness of Jane Austen's place in popular culture and her reputation as author and as personality. And that was very much in contrast to the way I understood Jane Austen. And the way I encountered her was we were an immigrant family and didn't really know that much about English literature. And my brother, who was 8.5 years older than me, he took an English class in college. And he discovered from this professor, recommended Jane Austen and Pride and Prejudice to him. So he read it and he came over to me and he said, "I think you'd really like this book." And so he gave me his copy of Pride and Prejudice, and then I read through all of them, and I remember reading Mansfield Park and storming into his room and saying, "What happened?" She spent, this long book with detail after detail, so thorough, and then she just rushes. Did she die? I thought maybe that could be like the only reason somebody would have stopped so short. So I've always wondered about these different Jane Austens, the one who is celebrated for being so absorbing in these romantic happy endings, and this other one who seemed to resist them and very much at those moments suddenly pull out all these interesting rhetorical ploys. So that contrast was really what inspired this. So I've been interested in it for a long time. I actually gave a talk on it about 25 years ago, and then just finally decided I have to write this. So next, please. And one of the things that happens, I've been corresponding with this guy. He's great. He loves Austen. Anyway, you wouldn't necessarily know that. But when you only think of her as in terms of these marriages and the happy endings, as wonderful as they are, it really makes them, homogenizes her novels and makes them all the same, if that's what you're kind of zooming in on. But actually, to me, I'm so impressed by how different her novels are and the challenges that she picks up when she moves from one novel to the next, the challenges that she imposes on herself, totally unnecessarily, but because she was such an aspiring, ambitious, excited artist and author. So these are, this just to summarize. So my book goes into it helps. It tries to explain through the nitty gritty. Like what are the specific things she does at the point of her endings that makes them different, and makes it kind of a very creative thing. And this is a list of the top 10 things she does. But I'm also zooming out a lot to how what she's doing very deeply and philosophically with each of her novels and their endings, and then how they're received and changed in popular culture. Like what film adaptations do interesting things with the endings, also which ones really mess up. but mostly I'm trying not to do too much of that. So one of the things is this sheer speed of the resolutions. Another one is just dialogue shrinks to near nothing frequently. Apophasis, which I'll get to in a second, it's a very pesky technique. The narrator intruding, suddenly asking rhetorical questions. What did she do? That kind of thing. And all of these, in many ways, they all share a metafictional aspect where it makes you realize, just like Susan said, makes you realize that you are reading fiction, right at the point when you don't want to be thinking about that. To me, the emotional kind of analogy is, imagine that you're in a theater and you're watching a production. The lights are out, the only lights that are on are on the stage. And suddenly someone turns the lights on in the theater before the play is over, right? And you're jarred suddenly out of that suspension of disbelief that you really want to indulge in, especially if it's something like a romantic happy ending that you're finally getting to indulge in. Then that's what she does. She doesn't take the happy ending away from us, but she does turn the lights on and expose kind of the puppetry behind the scenes. She also uses symmetry of plot in some really interesting ways, sudden coincidences, and like Deus ex machina resolutions where out of the blue things work out, like for example, the fact that Mrs. Weston's turkeys are stolen in Emma, and suddenly Mr. Woodhouse is willing to let them marry because he wants the protection. And then a really interesting interest in hyperbole and perfection. And I've looked at her manuscripts, and I'm fascinated by the way she sticks the word perfection in wherever she can near the endings. She tries, like in her manuscript for Persuasion, she tried 3 different times to put perfection different places. All right, next. So just a little bit, just a couple of examples of these. Apophasis. So this is, here's an example from Sense and Sensibility. How soon Edward had walked himself into the proper resolution, however, how soon an opportunity of exercising it occurred, in what manner he expressed himself, and how he was received, need not be particularly told. So it's a means of telling us what we're not going to be told. And so these are fairly key aspects of a proposal, I would think, especially how he was received. And Austen says we don't need to know them. Okay, next. Another example. She spoke then on being so entreated. What did she say? Just what she ought, of course. A lady always does. She said enough to show there need not be despair, and to invite him to say more himself. From Emma. And this is so playful in so many ways, right? We don't want to be thinking of her as a lady at this point. We really want the woman speaking from her heart rather than this kind of play making us aware that Austen is in charge. Okay. Rhetorical questions here is like who can be in doubt of what followed for Persuasion? Sense and Sensibility with such a confederacy against her, what could Marianne do? Next. I'm just going to go with these. The narrator, then other times the narrator all of a sudden comes out from behind the stage. She comes out, her quill is still wet with ink, and she's saying, ha ha, here I am, and reminding us that she is author. So my Fanny, indeed, at this very time, I have the satisfaction of knowing, must have been happy in spite of everything. Okay. So So this was what part of what was the question for me. Why do this? And these things occur almost always at the very end. All of these techniques just really cluster at the end with the happy endings. And then when you think about plot, in the last 1 to 3 pages of all her novels, things like this, if you look at this list, Mr. Woodhouse's objection, as I mentioned, disappears with the poultry thieves. General Tilney's objection to Henry's marriage, because there's suddenly a titled fiancé for his daughter, whom we didn't even know about before. Mansfield Park, expectations that Fanny should marry Henry Crawford because he elopes adulterously with Maria, and Edmund's suddenly he realizes he could love Fanny instead of Mary Crawford. And Marianne's sense that Colonel Brandon is too old and infirm suddenly disappears, and he's a suitable partner in marriage. All of these are within 1 to 3 pages from the end of the novels. And so what some people have, it's been interesting to read about how people have treated these. I tried to explain these endings, or the style of her endings, unusual distancing that she does. And a lot of people will say it's because she's an embittered spinster, or it's because she didn't marry, she knew she wasn't going to marry at this point, so she doesn't want to let anybody else have the joy or something. So there are many different psychological and character kind of interpretations of why she does this. And to me, it's very important to try at least to see why, as an artist, she actively and selectively chose to do this. And to me, it's part of her specific way of educating the reader. I think she cared deeply about teaching and the role of literature in teaching. So one of the ways that she uses a novel to do her teaching is to separate out romance, recognition, and restoration in her endings. And she purposely puts things like recognition where the individual comes to know herself, or restoration where things are put back in order. Those things resolve first before the romance. So it's like these things can be within our control, right? But ultimately, there's a lot of luck or providence or chance, whatever you want to call it, involved with this happening. So she foregrounds what's within our control, and then attaches a price tag in a way to the additional romantic ending. Okay. Yep. And there's that little discount, and that lovely lady. This is from a portraitist named Adam Buck, who is a Irish portraitist, and I really like his work. All right, well, that's it.
Thank you both for sharing about your books. The title of tonight's joint moderated discussion is Reading and Feeling: How Jane Austen's Novels Work. So for this next question, let's narrow in on just one of Austen's novels. Let's go with her most popular and probably well-known novel, Pride and Prejudice. So Susan, starting with you, how does Austen use reading in that novel, in Pride and Prejudice, to link her readers to her characters' concerns?
Well, Jeopardy already gave us a hint in Fordyce's Sermons, which is probably the one book that is most specifically named in Pride and Prejudice. In fact, the only book that's specifically named. But she also, we're interested in that, and I was interested in what happens. What are in those 3 pages Mr. Collins reads before Lydia interrupts, but also what did they not get to hear, and so that kind of set me off down a path. And I read Fordyce's Sermons so that you don't have to if you don't want to.
Well, and she published an edition. She published an edition of it,
I
too.
did, yes. So anyway, I'm not a good model of the Fordycean woman, and neither is Elizabeth Bennet. But anyway, it is an interesting read in certain ways. But also, when Darcy and Elizabeth and Miss Bingley are discussing, what an accomplished woman is, there's it's clear to me that Darcy has thought about female conduct a lot. And if you think about it, when he was 23, his parents die, right? And he not only inherits Pemberley, which is a big, responsibility, but he also inherits the responsibility for his 11-year-old sister. And 11 years old is a pretty critical period for a young girl who needs to be educated. And I think it's clear from that conversation, and it got clearer to me as I started reading conduct books, from those Netherly scenes in particular, that Darcy has been reading conduct books. And one of the things that he says when, Miss Bingley has this helpful list of, what an accomplished woman ought to have, languages and art and music and all these things. And he says, yeah, all this she must have, but one thing more, the improvement of her mind by extensive reading. Well, there's in fact a conduct book by Hester Mulso Chapone called Letters on the Improvement of the Mind. So one of the things that, in fact, one of the main things that Chapone does in that book is talk about reading and what you ought to be reading as a young girl. So I started looking at that. And also I was thinking, well, if Darcy has read Fordyce's sermons to young women, and if Mr. Collins, has read it and thinks it's appropriate, what are the odds that they have also read Fordyce's addresses to young men? Now, it's interesting. Fordyce says, addresses is kind of a sequel. Fordyce says, young men don't like to be preached to. So instead of sermons to young men, he writes addresses. He doesn't think women will mind, apparently. But anyway, so those are the three books that I looked at, and they're very interesting. They all talk about wit, about vanity and pride, and humility. These things that the characters are clearly wrestling with. And one thing that's pretty interesting to me is that it's not so much that Austen objects to some of the things anyway, the cautions that Chapone and Fordyce give against too flashy an exercise of wit, but she's willing to apply those as well to Darcy, and to men. And if we think about, Elizabeth acknowledging that her wit has gotten her into some trouble, and it's partly because it's a quick kind of apprehension of a truth that might not be a truth but sounds really good, and Darcy does some of the same thing, the whole Elizabeth is not handsome enough to tempt me, and that's a kind of witty rejoinder to the Bingleys pushing him to dance, and there are other examples of that as well. So that's I think one of the things that comes through in the whole conduct book business there. The whole idea of the accomplished woman is something that gets thought about and considered all the way through the novel, and these conduct books clearly are wrestling with that. And the roles within the virtuous marriage and the family are also things that these books are training their readers for. And Austen is kind of working with those ideas as well. But besides those issues, one of the things that I think I got most interested in with Austen's use of the conduct book was the way in which she uses, especially Chaperon, as part of this sort of deep structuring of her novel. Chaperon is writing to her niece these letters on the improvement of the mind. Her niece is 15, and she says to her niece, okay, you're entering in this very dangerous period of life. Well, there are some other 15-year-old girls we know in the novel who are also in a dangerous period, right? Lydia, and before that, Georgiana Darcy, who goes to the seaside when she's 15 and almost ends up eloping with the same guy. So that's kind of in there, that aunt niece or relationship that kind of spotlights that dangerous moment, but also it kind of is a reflection on Mrs. Gardner. One of the things that the aunt Hester Chaperon tells her niece is, well, I can't be with you all the time, so find a woman who is 8 to 10 years older than you are, and of good character, and is congenial, but to whom you can attach yourself in society, and she can kind of help you through some of the things you're going to do. Well, Elizabeth Bennet has Charlotte Lucas as, to some degree, a mentor figure, and we see Charlotte giving her advice, until Charlotte's advice turns out, until Charlotte kind of takes the advice she's been giving Elizabeth and marries Mr. Collins. Well, at that moment of the, Elizabeth saying, I can never trust her judgment again, even if she is Charlotte Lucas. Charlotte sort of disappears really from that advice-giving mode. The next chapter, practically, Mrs. Gardner shows up in the novel, and she becomes the advice-giving aunt, who then is giving the advice about Wickham and everything. And so we see that structure kind of underlying the plot of the novel, until we come to a moment where Elizabeth doesn't really need the advice anymore, and both of them sort of disappear from that role. Elizabeth starts kind of thinking differently about things. So that structure of the conduct book made me see, what I was learning in the conduct book made me see how carefully Austen had structured the novel. It also made me wonder, she talks about how she's lopped and cropped the novel since the 1790s when she started it to 1813 when she published it. How much what exactly did she lop and crop here? How much more did the conduct literature, which in the 1790s was huge, and Chaperon and Fordyce were like the number 2 and number 3 sellers in terms of conduct books. How much role was conduct literature playing then, and how much did she just kind of tamp that down so that it was just this kind of deep structural aspect of the novel? So that was a very long answer, I'm sorry. But
that's great. Thank you for that. So Austen is laying the groundwork to connect her audiences to feeling through these clues about what characters are reading. And Inga, your book too is intently focused on Austen's audiences and how she's using the narrator's voice to probe and work her audience. So what is, in Pride and Prejudice, what is Austen trying to make her readers feel in the ending? And if your title of your book is Jane Austen and the Price of Happiness, what is the price of happiness in Pride and Prejudice?
Well, it's interesting. I'm not sure I can answer all those things. But in Pride and Prejudice, when I was first writing this book, I thought I thought Pride and Prejudice was an exception. I thought maybe it didn't fit the pattern of these other novels. But then the more I looked, the more I saw some of the same things going on. And one of the things that she does is talk a lot about civility. So you get this rare chance to listen in on this romantic dialogue with Darcy, and the novel has a lot more time after the successful proposal than only Emma matches it. But then when they're having this teasing kind of wonderful conversation, Elizabeth says, "But we have both." I'm going to quote it wrong, but we have both grown in civility since then. And civility is such a strange word to encounter at that moment. But it echoes an earlier passage where Elizabeth Bennet says, teasingly says early on, "Isn't general incivility the very essence of love?" You know. But the move from love to civility, or love with civility, is one of the big things that happens at the end. And then the building of this, Austen spends pretty significant amount of time zooming out to this. It's not like it doesn't stay intimate, right? It zooms almost immediately out again to this bigger societal growth that happens, where they build their own little community, certain people excluded, other people only visit very rarely, you know, and it becomes this kind of interesting political thing, because you have the wealthy, you know, lower aristocrat with the middle class, relatively penniless Elizabeth, those two coming together to form this more perfect union of sorts. And then, and so there's a lot of, I think, consideration almost from like a political, social perspective, rather than actually remaining intimate, if that makes sense. I mean, that's only one of the things that happens, but yeah.
Great, thank you so much. So before we get to audience Q&A, we're going to do one more thing, and I'm really excited about this next part. Inga and Susan are such good friends, and they've read each other's books, and they've wrestled with one another's ideas. And so what I want to give you each the opportunity to do for just a few minutes is to spotlight a section of your friend's book, to read a passage that you found particularly compelling, and then to maybe give a few of your own thoughts about that passage. So I think we said that you were going to start and reflect on Susan.
Yeah, I think this is a sweet idea. And yes, and Susan has definitely been a big part of all my scholarship. So I chose something from fairly early in her book, because one of I think the beautiful things in it to me is the way the books come alive, and Jane Austen comes alive as a reader. And there's this section called "We Live in the Library." I'm going to read just a little bit of it. For Jane Austen's contemporaries, reading was not exclusively, maybe not predominantly, a solitary pursuit with benefits for the self alone. There were times, of course, for solitary reading. When, for example, Elizabeth, that's her brother Edward's wife, died after the birth of her 11th child, the young Edward and George Austen, ages 14 and 13, and at school in Winchester, went to stay with their grandmother and their Aunt Jane and Martha Lloyd at Southampton. Jane described their activities to Cassandra, who had gone to Godmersham to help with the birth and stayed to care for their mourning family. While I write now, George is most industriously making and naming paper ships, at which he afterwards shoots with horse chestnuts, brought from Steventon on purpose. And Edward is equally intent over the Lake of Killarney novel, twisting himself about in one of our great chairs. It's a letter from 1808. Another time, while Mrs. Austen read Sir John Carr's descriptive travels in the southern and eastern parts of Spain and the Balearic Isle, Jane was reading Sir Charles William Pasley's essay on the military policy and institutions of the British Empire. All right. And so Susan goes on to say, much of the time reading was an unmitigatedly social activity. Reading aloud is regularly mentioned in Austen's letters and family narratives. In the household at Southampton, when James and Mary Austen visited, the family's evening amusement was the female Quixote. To me, a very high one, she said, Austen writes, as I find the work quite equal to what I remember it. Mrs. F.A., to whom it was new, enjoys it as one could wish. The other Mary, I believe, has little pleasure from that or any book. 1807. Mary's lack of pleasure and interest in reading recurs over the years in Jane's letters, suggesting both intellectual and moral failings. And then, reading aloud was one of Jane Austen's talents. In at least one instance, when she and her mother read the newly published Pride and Prejudice to their neighbor, Miss Benn, she felt impatient with her mother's technique, which even temporarily affected her own judgment of the novel. I had some fits of disgust. But I believe something must be attributed to my mother's too rapid way of getting on, and though she perfectly understands the characters herself, she cannot speak as they ought. February, that's from 1813. Okay, well, I could read more, but I love the way that Susan uses the letters so very, very thoroughly and ties them to this whole culture of reading, culture of sharing books, culture of living the books, really, and so often, for better or worse, judging people by how they read the books. So that's what I chose.
Thank you. Thank you, Inger. Oops, Inger. I've been wrestling with my swallowed G today. Anyway, I chose a different sort of passage here, and I hope you don't have any fits of disgust in my way of reading it. But I'm really, one of the things I love about this book is the way in which we make the connections between it's not just a study of how the endings work, but how they work on readers and why. And I mean, I think it's really a sort of large question that you're grappling with. And I really love the way that it, the terms in which you discuss it for us are so personal. So I'm going to read a bit from the ending. Austen challenges us to rethink the protagonists of the marriage plot, rebelling against the perfect and unrealistic heroines of Richardson, Radcliffe, or Burney. She redefines the prerequisites of happy endings as well as what qualifies as heroic action, particularly by women. In turning to the heroism of common things, as she does most explicitly with Catherine Morland of Northanger Abbey, Austen makes heroism available to all. This is not to say all our heroes or heroines. She shows that spectacular and rare situations are not requisite for demonstrating courage or for making substantial decisions. Sense and Sensibility's Eleanor wields words and exertion in her neighbor's parlors with a courage equal to that of many a soldier, showing that daily life is just as valuable fodder for heroic action as the battlefield or the podium. Fanny transitions from a creep mouse in the house of her relatives to the moral center of the estate and the novel, showing that happy endings need not necessarily fall to the most charming or beautiful characters. Austen's revision of female heroism is perhaps most pronounced in Anne Elliot, who travels among commonwealths at a distance of only 3 miles and shows greater fortitude in a crisis than the battle-trained naval officers around her. Choosing to speak or hold silence, choosing to walk or take a carriage, choosing to make or break an appointment. Small decisions can require courage and indicate character, virtue, worldview, even heroism. These choices are all extremely relevant to the daily life of readers. Each of her novels asserts the importance not only of companionate marriage, but also of the marriage of equals, with a foundation of friendship and mutual respect. That may sound commonsensical today, but her models were as new for the novel as were her complex means of portraying them. Austen does indeed provide excellent advice on healthy relationships and successful marriages. Even though her characters are entirely fictional, they are also based on rock-solid observation and understanding of human nature. Her genius was in creating realistic characters that simultaneously provide us with fantasy outlets for the lives we would wish to lead, remind us that real life does not usually live up to our ambitions, and teach us how we as readers perpetuate unhealthy expectations. Austen is not an embittered spinster who kills hope in the bosom of her reader. Like her admired Samuel Johnson, she understood both that great things cannot be achieved without hope, and that few things can destroy us more fully than disappointment in the absence of resources for solitude. Her novels educate her readers' sentiments, preparing us, if we read them carefully, for all sorts of real-life endings. Austen weans readers from the charm and power of the drive for fictional fantasy happiness and eases us back into reality, achieving greater didactic effect. And then I'm going to skip a little to here. Many tend to look at her novels nostalgically, as pretty dreams of order and harmony that contrast with our own world of chaos and loneliness. However, it's worth considering that they may have served the same psychological function for the author herself. That's a great idea. I read that again today and I thought, wow. There is an immense distance between the world she inhabited and the world she portrays. Her heroine's happy endings are far from any reality that she herself ever witnessed. The power of Austen's endings comes from her unusual juxtaposition of seeming opposites: romantic happiness and individual fulfillment, tradition and innovation, comedy and tragedy, fantasy and realism, desire for happy endings, and the suspicion of happy endings, hope, and contentment. She manages to provide both while showing the benefits and weaknesses of each solution without the other. Any attempt to limit her novels to a singular, unironic vision inevitably diminishes their wisdom and value. For better or worse, Austen never allows us to lose our own hope for perfect felicity. Yet, in a world where cinematic and social media expectations often flee the hard realities behind their screens, Austen's nuanced art teaches readers that cultivating one's own sympathy and sense of responsibility for others' welfare might itself, whatever else may happen, be a source of happiness. Well, I love that for so many reasons, and some of them I already mentioned, but I really love that idea that for Austen, the books work in the same way that they work for us. And I think we all probably started out reading her books with that desire for nostalgia. Well, I should maybe just speak for myself, but I loved them partly because they were set back there. And I loved them for the happy ending. And I wasn't as bothered as you were by the speed of that. I was just happy, that everything worked out. But I think you are so right, and you have done such a beautiful job of articulating the complexity of this. That's why I chose that passage, and that's why I love the book. So thank you.